kids are playing soccer. I mean football, but since most of our viewers are American, I'm going to use soccer. Soccer. I'm not trying to cuss. It just sounds the same.
Hey everyone, welcome to another Behind the Lens episode, and I'm wearing an amazing shirt that makes me look so cool. He might not think so, but welcome back to another episode. We had great responses from the first two episodes. Had a couple people comment, pointing out some things we missed, so thank you so much. But also,
don't feel bad about adding some things.
Please don't. But yes, thank you so much for just listening. We really enjoyed doing this. And if you didn't figure out, we might do a couple episodes a night if they didn't figure that out already. But it works that way. But we're really excited. What are we talking about today, Daniel?
Today, we are talking about... Oh, wait, I turned it off. We're talking about this.
Oh, and what would that be? That's a camera. But what specifically about a camera?
What specifically?
Yes.
Well, we're talking about camera settings.
Oh.
So when you look at a display of your camera, you can see a bunch of different things, different settings. What do they mean? What are they good for?
Mm-hmm.
How to change for different scenarios? That's exactly what we're going to talk today.
Exactly. And I know it actually, I was even thinking about this. It can be very confusing because I remember when I picked up my first camera for the first time, I'm looking at like, what do these things do?
Yes.
It's very intimidating.
There are two kinds of people. One, that is like, oh, auto mode. Sure thing. I'm done.
I'm partially that.
And then there's a second one who's like, well, I'm going to use some things in auto, some things in manual.
That's me.
It's okay. It's okay.
I'm okay.
And then there's the third version,
which is you.
Me, which is like, oh, there's a letter M. That means manual. Everything manual.
Yes.
That's how I like it.
So basically, we're going to be talking today about what camera settings, like what are they specifically first when you're looking at a screen, but then also what maybe he uses, what the difference is between his camera and my camera. There's a lot of things we could go into detail about. But we just want you to give you the basics, kind of like understanding it. So that way when you go out and shoot your first photo shoot, your first video, you're like, oh, I remember what Daniel and Ben said. Oh, I remember that. Yeah. And hopefully you can use it.
Wow, there's this new scenario that I never did before. Okay, how can I change this on this setting to make this image look better? Boom.
Yep, that's what we're here for. So why don't you start? We are starting with his Nikon, which is a little different setup on the back than mine. We'll go over that as well. So I'll have B-roll going too, so you'll be able to see what we're pointing at and stuff.
So basically the things that you can change is pretty similar in both cameras, just because one is Canon, one is Nikon, one is mirrorless, one is DSLR.
It's still similar.
It's really similar.
Yeah.
The idea is the same.
Same concept.
So when it comes to camera settings, there's, well, I'm not going to say holy trinity, but there's the trinity of settings. The three main ones.
The trinity. Sorry. I'm sorry. Continue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
One of them, so it's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO.
Which we did talk about a little bit last
last
episode.
A little bit we talked about it. But a little bit more details about what they are, what they do. First one is shutter speed. Well, the most simple way I can describe shutter speed is the speed of the shutter.
Wow.
You can quote me on that. But basically what it means is that, you remember when I told about how the camera is set up, about having that mirror, and it flips
the whole boop boop.
Yeah,
that thing. Yeah, that thing.
Yeah, so that whole thing. Basically, what shutter speed means is the amount of time when light hits the sensor and the sensor receives the data and processes it. The shorter the time is, so for example, my camera right now is at, let's change it a little bit, is 1/180, which means that light is hitting the sensor for 1 for 180th of a second.
So 1/180th of a second. There we go.
So 1/180th, yes, of a second.
English is your second language. It's okay.
Yes. So basically, the shorter the time is, the less amount of time light has to hit the sensor, which means that the sensor is going to receive less light, so the picture is going to be darker.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, when you have more time for light to hit the sensor, you get more light, which is going to result in a brighter image. That's basically how to look at.
And that's usually like on my camera specifically. There's like a weird kind of like an orange half circle, kind of a half circle, and then there's usually a number, usually 1 dash, like you said, number. So every camera, that's really what it's going to say. There's nothing different with that at all between cameras.
Yeah. A basic rule of thumb when it comes to shutter speed, and we're probably going to talk about it when it comes to videography and recording, is that when you record a video, you use a specific frame rate, which is how many frames you're recording in 1 second. It can be 24, which is the best, or you can be lame, you can use 30, or you can be a horrible. No, you're not a horrible person if you're using 60 frames.
I use it.
But
don't be upset, okay? I use it.
But or if you're in the States, you can use 25 or 50.
Yeah.
These are the main frame rates, or 120, 240, whatever. Basically, you want your frame rate to be double of the number. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, which some people tend to do, you're using 120 for shutter speed. If you're using 24 frames per second, you're using 48 or 50 or whichever is closest to the double of the frame rate. So that's frame rate, not frame rate, shutter speed.
Yep.
In a nutshell.
So that was very quick nutshell. So if you have a friend that wants to know about shutter speed, send them to this part of the video, but then the whole video as well.
And also with shutter speed, obviously, but it's the same actually for all of them. But if you're in a darker environment, let's say you're outside. You're taking pictures of stars. You're taking pictures of.
You like those pictures?
Yes, or anything else.
Thinking of your future, right? Thinking of your future under the stars.
Yes. So if you're in a darker environment, or you're inside, like here in the
camp, like during
room,
camp,
in the camp when the lights are off, things are a little bit darker. You want a brighter image. One way to do that is to reduce shutter speed. But be aware of shutter speed, because you can use them. You can use different shutter speed for different scenarios. So if you're taking pictures of sports, like we're outside on a soccer field, kids are playing soccer. I mean football, but since most of our viewers are American, I'm going to use soccer. Soccer. I'm not trying to cuss. It just sounds the same. So if you're outside taking pictures of kids playing basketball.
Oh, the show's going down the road.
Volleyball is a good sport. So they're playing volleyball. You're taking pictures of them. Since there's a lot of motion, a lot of movement, a lot of quick motions, you want to have a short shutter speed. So like 1/1000 or something, to 640, whatever. Because if you're using a long shutter speed, so like 1/60th, for example, it might be good for a video if you're using 30 frames per second. But during that 1/60th of a second, there's so much motion going on that your image is gonna be not blurred, but like washed away.
Yeah.
But when you're taking a portrait, you can use 1/60th a second because no one's moving.
Yeah.
People are supposed to stand still, so you can use 1/60th of a second to take a portrait. So different numbers go for different applications.
And I know it sounds weird because we say, well, wait, what do you mean larger? The larger, you mean this number gets smaller? Yes. So the more, the 1/60th would be the larger than 1/1000th. I know it's weird.
Yeah.
It's like most of the English language. It's weird. But yeah, so that's shutter speed.
Yes.
That's shutter speed. Now, how does that relate to our next setting?
So the next one is actually aperture. And the the problem is the same with aperture as with shutter speed numbers.
Yes.
So, with shutter speed, the bigger the number
It's the F number,
like,
if you remember from last episode.
Yeah. So shutter speed is always 1 dash and a number. Or if you're going over a number, or you're going over a second, it's going to be 1 second, 2 seconds, whatever. But we're not talking about that. That's for taking pictures of stars. We're not here to talk about taking pictures of stars now. So the bigger the number is with shutter speed, after the number 1, the darker the image is going to be. The same with the F number or the aperture. The bigger the number, the darker the image is going to be. The smaller the number, the bigger the aperture, so the brighter the image is going to be. If it's not confusing, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Maybe predestination, but still.
Or the kingdom.
The kingdom.
No, that's simple. But yeah, so that is. I know it sounds confusing, but honestly, I think you can admit to this too. When you start messing with it, it becomes a lot simpler. Like when you're actually using a camera,
when you're using it,
it makes it a lot
clear.
Simpler. Yeah.
Like, because you can either scroll this to the left or scroll it to the right, or if you have something else up or down.
I just have
whichever.
arrows. Yeah.
So obviously, it's going to be clear that if you're turning left, you're making the number go smaller, which makes the aperture go wider, which is going to have more light coming in. It's going to result in a brighter image. So, what does aperture do? What does aperture do? You want to say it, or do I want to say it?
You're on a roll, but I'll add stuff to it, yes.
Okay, sure.
Aperture is basically the light, though, right? Basically.
Aperture is the light.
It's the thing you said. It's the thing you said. The whole.
Basically, when you're looking at the camera this way, light is coming in. But obviously the lens is this tall, but light is not going through the lens this whole length or this whole height, or since it's a circle, this whole area, because there's another circle in it, and I don't know if, well, this is pretty small.
Yeah, it's very tiny.
Yeah, I have to have it attached to the camera.
A macro lens.
Yeah. So basically, the aperture is. So when the light is going through the lens, the aperture is basically a hole where the light can go through. The bigger the aperture is, so the wider, the more area the light has to go through, which is going to result in a brighter image. That's a small f number. So like f 2.0, 1.4, 1.8, whatever. The smaller the hole is, the smaller place for light is to go through the lens and hit the sensor. That's a higher f number, so like f14, 15, even f5.6, doesn't matter. And that's going to result in a darker image. So the f number is basically how big the opening is within the lens where the light can go through to hit the sensor. Now, obviously, the aperture, the f number, has a lot of other applications like bokeh or depth of field, which we kind of mentioned.
And you guys saw some footage of that, yeah.
So yes, the smaller the f number is, the wider the opening is going to be, which is going to give more depth of field. So the background is going to be more blurred if I take a picture of you. And the smaller the aperture is, so the bigger the f number is, that means the less light is coming through and a darker image, but also the background of my image of you is going to be sharper.
Yeah. And I think in ways you can use this, I know personally, so I'll use, f1.4, 2.0, especially like when, let's say, I'm shooting a campfire, when I'm around the campfire, I will use that because, one, it's dark out, and you want to let as much light, even though there's not a ton, as much light in. But like, I was in Budapest the other day, and I used pretty much like an I think 13 most of the day, 11 to 13, because it was super bright out. Yeah. And obviously with the white buildings and stuff, it's chaos.
Back.
So it depends on your circumstance. So I always say, whatever you're shooting, make sure you preview it first. You do not want to be doing it like I used to. Sometimes I would mess up and I'd be in the middle of filming something. I'm like, oh, shoot. And then you're trying to adjust it. Then it looks so weird. So I would say figure out what you need. So like when we sat down, we were kind of like, okay, what light do we need? Or kind of that. And that's for a whole nother story. But that's what I do. I make sure is my F number the right number. My aperture is my shutter speed the right. So that's a big key.
So that's aperture in a nutshell. Let's move on to ISO.
Yes.
That's the third member of
the camera Trinity.
The camera Trinity, yes.
We're making statements here on Behind the Lens. We're making statements.
So ISO is gonna be a number again.
We love numbers here. He loves numbers.
I want to be a mathematician. Which it varies what the range of the ISO is. So for example, this camera, the ISO can go from 100 to 12,800.
Yeah, mine's from 100 to
25,000.
Something like that. Something crazy like that.
So you don't really have to know. It doesn't really matter.
No, it doesn't.
In most cases, you're not even going to use the higher ISO numbers. There's not really much like opportunities where you would need 12,800 for ISO.
Yes, that is true.
Like unless you're shooting with an f4 lens and you're making pictures of people playing sports at dark night. Like
first off, that's what you're doing. That's just crazy. But
yeah. Like if I'm taking pictures of a sports event and there are no lights
of soccer
to make it more fun, and I'm like, okay, I cannot use the shutter speed for one of 200 or 2000 or whatever because the location and the object is just so dark, and I want my image to be sharp.
Yeah.
So I can crank up the ISO, but that's not as simple as that. Because, okay, first of all, what is ISO? ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor. So the more sensitive the sensor is for light, which you can change by increasing the ISO number, the more light, the brighter the image is going to be. So if the sensor is less sensitive to light, then the image is going to be darker. But that's not that simple because when you're increasing the ISO, you're increasing the sensitivity of the sensor, which is not just going to result in a brighter image, but also a noisier image or a fuzzier image, or I don't know what the right word for it is.
You're right. Noisy's right.
Yeah.
Noisy in camera terms is fuzzy. Or when you're
like grainy or
like
something.
when you went to grandma's house and your TV is a little fuzzy. Yeah, that's what that is.
Yeah. So there's like with this camera, for example, it's not as good anymore. It's not as good as handling high ISO. So in most cases, I never like to go over 1600 ISO because after that, the noise gets really, really visible. And I hate noise reduction because when you're doing noise reduction, when you're editing pictures, which is what it is, it's reducing noise. The whole image is going to be too soft. And I don't really like that. So because of that, I'm just not I'm not going over 1600.
Yeah.
For ISO.
Yeah. So that's basic. I mean, ISO is one of those things where, I mean, honestly, I don't know how much often you really do. I mean, obviously you shoot manual, so you'll mess with it a little bit more than I do. But for the most part, like if I have like right now, if you watched my video a couple days ago, you saw my setup where I'm at right now in the room I'm at. I pretty much know what it needs to be set at every time. So I don't really adjust it too much. I know like what the aperture needs to be and everything like that. So again, I think we reiterate that anytime you do, anything with video or photography, scout your location and understand these. I think when you understand these settings, it makes shooting stuff so much easier.
Yeah.
At least in my perspective, it makes things so much easier.
Yeah.
I would say, and then that leads us to the top little fun thing.
Before we go there, just one thing, and it's more of a camera accessory, so it's not really for this topic, but there's something called ND filters.
Oh yes, I might have one. Maybe I don't know. I'll have to check
Um,
that later. We'll check our accessories episode, which will be
the next one.
next
Yeah.
week. So next week,
week, yeah.
check in for that, and we'll probably have some different accessories you can
Yeah.
watch. But anyways,
But the ND filter. So
it's basically sunglasses.
yes, it's basically
sunglasses for your camera.
And the reason why I wanted to mention it now is because all the three settings that we just talked about, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, they are gonna make your image either brighter or darker. And there are situations.
Sorry, there's a bug, and it's really
Yeah,
annoying.
there's a mosquito. And there are some situations where you just cannot make your image be darker, you know, because let's say that you're making pictures outside or a video. Yeah, video might be better. And you're taking the ISO as low as you can to 100. And you want to shoot some cinematic or like really epic shots or epic video. So you want to use a low aperture. You don't want to make it into 14 or something because you want a good depth of field.
Yeah.
But also like because you're shooting video and you're shooting even in 60 frames per second, which would mean that you would use 120 for your shutter speed. Still, you look at it and like, wow, this is just way too bright. Like still, because there's so much direct sunlight, the image is just blown out because the object is like white or whatever. And you're like, okay, what can I do? I cannot make the ISO lower, which would result in a darker image. I don't want to crank up the aperture because I want a good depth of field, but I also don't want to crank up the shutter speed crank up the shutter speed because I want to have that the shutter speed for that specific frame rate. That's where the ND filter comes in, which you can just put on the lens.
Like sunglasses.
Yeah, and as you said, it's basically sunglasses for your camera. So that's just a really handy tool for a camera set if you're having one. It might come handy at some point.
Definitely. So that is the basics of those settings. There's one last thing we wanted to touch on before we end the episode, and that is what I like to call the bump on the top of your camera, because I have they're each different. So like we'll kind of, as you probably noticed through this episode, we've had different shots of both cameras, but his is definitely different than mine, but it's still the same function. They're just different settings inside of those.
Yeah, and maybe different icons for the setting, which don't let it fool you. So basically, when you look at my camera settings, these are different modes in which I can record in. Some camera manufacturers or camera brands, they would include a video recording setting for this, so you can only make videos when you're in that setting. What I like about this one is that it doesn't have that. There's a record button, but I can use the record button in any other camera mode.
Yep, same with Canon, which I love too as well.
So there are some models which is a little bit different. But that's just something. So basically in mine there are, first of all, 4 letters. There's M, A, S, and P. The M stands for manual, which obviously means that it's manual, so you're in charge of everything. And if something goes wrong, it's your fault.
It's true.
The second one is A. A means aperture priority auto. What it does is that you can set a specific number for your aperture. And it's not going to change that. It's going to change the shutter speed, it's going to change the ISO based upon the lighting situation. But that number is going to be the same. So if you know that you want to record something really cinematic and you want a good depth of field, and you're not going to give up on the f2.0 or 1.4 or 1.8 or whatever f number you have available. So you can set the f number, and then if you're going into a darker environment, then it's going to change the shutter speed and the ISO based upon the situation. If you're going outside, it's going to change the ISO and the aperture, the f number. No, that's the same thing. The ISO and the shutter speed based upon that.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the letter S, which is shutter priority auto. Same thing, but here you're not setting the f number. You're setting the shutter speed. is the same thing.
Yep, same.
You go to different environments, it's going to change the other two based upon the lighting situation. And the last one is P, which is programmed auto, which I have never ever used. And if I am right, you can, as far as I know, it's not for like setting the ISO and then the other two, but you can choose like any setting, you set it to auto, and then it's gonna just play with the other one.
Yeah.
And then obviously there's the auto with a flash.
And there's a lot of other ones too.
Yeah.
And like, cause we can keep going, but like mine's different because mine doesn't have MA SP. Mine has automatic, has manual, but mine's different, and you'll see it kind of like you shift it to like manual, but then you have two options on the screen. So it's kind of interesting how my camera works because it's kind of like one of those things where it's trying to make it easier for you, which I do love because especially as someone that was new when I got it, it was very easy. But then, like, being around him, I've started to use manual more, so I haven't really used some of the other settings that much. But, like, in mine, they have, like, scene settings. There's so many different things that you can use. And I would just say, like, practice with those, check them out, see what you like, and it makes everything a lot easier.
Yeah, and on this one, too, there's one for scene, which basically lets you, like, there's night portrait, night landscape, party indoor, beach, snow, sunset, dawn or dusk, pet portrait, like all these useless features, I think.
Yeah.
Then there's another mode for portrait, which obviously is gonna help you to have that portrait look for your image. So it's gonna change the settings with that. There's one for landscape. So if you know you're gonna shoot landscape, but you don't know what the settings should be like, then you can just choose that, and it's gonna automatically make the settings be optimized for a landscape photo. Then there's a child photo, which
that sounds really wrong, but
it's weird. Sports,
basic
close up, effects. Again, it has night vision and some other things. So basically, the ones that you should use is, like on this one, for example, everything from the M to the auto. Use the auto with or without the flash. Use the manual. Use the aperture priority. Use the shutter priority. Use the programmed ones.
Yep.
The other ones, I will say they're useless.
Yeah.
But they're not really, like, if you know how to do manual photos, and by the way, I encourage you to try using manual and practice with it, make mistakes, learn from the mistakes. It's still better than just using a landscape setting that the camera automatically gives you, and then you're never gonna get better. If you're using just automatic for the whole time, it's not gonna improve your skills.
Yeah.
But jumping into the deep water, using manual all the time, and making those mistakes will eventually help you to learn from the mistakes and be better and be like, oh, it's a manual setting. That's child's play for me. I use it all the time. And
yeah. So I guess as we finish up, it's these are settings. These are the basic of how you do a camera, do pictures, do photography, videography. But I would say this: practice, get yourself out there, do it. Yeah. That's what's helped me over the years that I've watched people. I've seen my dad do it. Now I'm doing it. So I really enjoyed it. And so I would say that's what you need to do in order to do that.
Yes. And when you look at this camera setting right now, you can see that there are all these other settings on the bottom. And I think maybe we could postpone the equipment and finish up with these.
I agree.
For the next one.
Yes.
Because it's already just camera gear.
Yeah.
Or camera settings.
I agree. So we're going to push back accessories for 2 weeks after this.
2 weeks from now.
Yes.
And next week we're going to talk about the rest of the settings.
Yes.
Because there are some really important settings there as well.
So that's what we're going to do next week. that's what we're going to continue to talk about. So we just do this on the spot. So like always, comment below, ask your questions, tell us what we did wrong, tell us what we did right. We enjoy that.
Yeah.
Also, we want to remind you that God is faithful and you can trust him. And if you like this video, thumbs it up and then subscribe below, hit that notification bell. And yeah, I hope you have a great day. I hope you enjoy what God has given you. And as always, we'll talk next time.